Hello and welcome back to another episode. Today, we're diving into something that every English learner faces common mistakes and, most importantly, how to fix them.
That's right. Whether it's confusing there and there, struggling with verb tenses, or mispronouncing tricky words, we've all been there. But don't worry, we'll break it all down for you today.
And the best part, once you become aware of these mistakes, you'll start correcting them naturally. So, let's get started.
Let's start with one of the most common mistakes mixing up there. There and there. I think every English learner has struggled with this at some point.
Absolutely, let's break it down. There is possessive, meaning something belongs to them, like their house is beautiful. There refers to a place, like the book is over there. And there is a contraction of they are, like they're coming to the party.
A good trick to remember is to say they are in your sentence. If it still makes sense, then there is the correct choice. If not, you probably need there or there.
That's a simple yet effective way to check. Now, another common mistake is with verb tenses, especially past simple versus present perfect. Many learners say, "I've seen that movie yesterday," but that's incorrect.
Right, because yesterday is a specific time in the past. So we should say, I saw that movie yesterday. The present perfect, like I have seen that movie, is used when we don't mention a specific time, just the experience.
Exactly. Another tricky area is prepositions. English has so many little words like in, on, and at, and they can be confusing. For example, people often say, "I'm in the bus" instead of "I'm on the bus."
Yeah, that's a classic one. We use on for public transport like buses, trains, and planes because we think of being on a surface, but we say in when talking about smaller vehicles, like I'm in a car.
Here's another one using make and do correctly. Many learners say, "I do a mistake" instead of "I make a mistake."
Good one. The general rule is that make is for creating something, like make a decision or make a mistake, while do is for actions, like do homework or do an exercise.
Speaking of mistakes, pronunciation is another common challenge. Many learners struggle with words like though, through, and tough.
Oh yes. Though sounds like do, through sounds like through, and tough sounds like tough. The spelling is tricky, but listening practice really helps.
Absolutely, speaking and listening regularly can make a huge difference. Alright, let's move on to another big one: false friends, or words that look similar in two languages, but have different meanings.
Oh, false friends can be really tricky. Do you have an example?
Yes, one of the most common ones is actual in English and actual in German. Many German speakers think actual means current, but it actually means real or genuine.
That's a great example. Another one is in Spanish, embarazada sounds like embarrassed, but it actually means pregnant. That could lead to some really awkward situations.
Oh, absolutely. Another confusing one is sensible. In English, it means practical or reasonable. But in French and Spanish, sensible means sensitive.
Right. This is why context is so important when learning new vocabulary. Just because a word looks familiar doesn't mean it has the same meaning.
Exactly. Another big mistake learners make is translating directly from their native language instead of thinking in English.
Yes. For example, in English, we say I'm 25 years old, but in many other languages, the phrase is structured as I have 25 years. Direct translation can lead to strange sentences.
That's why immersion and practice are so important. The more you listen and speak, the more natural these phrases will become.
Absolutely. Speaking of natural English, let's talk about common expressions that learners often get wrong. One that I hear a lot is, "Can you explain me?"
Oh yes, it should be "Can you explain to me?" Because explain is a verb that needs an indirect object with to. You wouldn't say "give me the book" as "give the book me," right?
That's a great way to think about it. Another one is, "I look forward to see you," which should be, "I look forward to seeing you."
Yes, after look forward to, we always use the ing form, not the base verb. It's a small detail, but it makes a big difference in sounding natural.
Speaking of small details, another thing learners struggle with is articles using a, n, or the correctly.
Oh yes, for example, people often say, "I have dog" instead of "I have a door." Every singular noun in English needs an article unless it's a proper noun.
Exactly. And let's not forget pronunciation mistakes. One of the most common is confusing the sounds of sheet and Well, you know.
Yes, or affect a tiny difference in pronunciation can completely change the meaning of a word.
That's why it's important to practice pronunciation and listen carefully to native speakers.
Absolutely. Do you have any final examples before we wrap up?
Definitely. Another common mistake is with prepositions, especially in on and at. Learners often mix them up because they work differently in other languages.
Oh yes, like I'm in the bus instead of I'm on the bus. Many learners say in because they're inside the bus. But in English, we say on for most public transportation.
Exactly. And with time expressions, we say at night, not in night, and on Monday, not in Monday. These little details can be tricky.
Another one is the difference between since and for. People often say, I've lived here since 5 years, but it should be for 5 years. Since is used with a specific point in time, like since 2018.
Right. And let's not forget the confusion between much and many. I often hear, I have much friends, but it should be I have many friends because friends is a countable noun.
Oh, and very verses too. Saying it's too hot means it's hotter than comfortable, but it's very hot just means it's really warm.
Great point. Another tricky one is fun versus funny. If you say, the party was funny, it sounds like the party made you laugh, but you probably meant to say, the party was fun.
Yes, and let's not forget bored and boring. Many learners say, I'm boring when they mean I'm bored. Saying I'm boring means you make other people feel bored.
Yes. Another classic mistake is with conditionals. Many learners say, if I would go, but the correct form is if I go. In first conditionals, we use present tense after if, not future.
That's a very common one. And let's talk about modal verbs. People often say, he must go instead of he must go. Unlike other verbs, modals don't need to be for the base verb.
Right. And another awkward mistake is saying, I want that you help me. In English, we say, I want you to help me. The structure is different from many other languages.
Oh, and people versus persons. Many learners say 5 persons, but in everyday English, we use people instead of persons.
Yes. And pronunciation is another huge challenge. Words like though, thought, and tough look similar, but sound completely different.
That's why listening practice is so important. Watching movies, listening to podcasts, and speaking with native speakers can really help.
Absolutely. Learning English takes time, but avoiding these common mistakes will help you sound more natural and confident.
Yes, keep practicing, keep listening, and most importantly, don't be afraid to make mistakes because that's how you learn.
Exactly. Thanks for joining us today. We hope this helps, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Another mistake that many learners make is using the when it's not necessary. For example, people say, I love the nature. But in English, we just say, I love nature without the.
Yes. Another tricky one is advice versus advices. Many learners say, can you give me some advices? But advice is uncountable. So we just say, can you give me some advice?
That reminds me of information too. People often say, I have an information. But information is also uncountable, so it should be, I have some information.
Good one. And let's talk about make versus do. This is a classic mistake. For example, people say, I do a mistake, but it should be, I make a mistake.
Yes, make is often used for creating or producing something, like make a decision or make a cake, while do is more about actions and tasks, like do homework or do a job.
Another confusing one is the versus tell. Many learners say, she said me that, but it should be, she told me that, because tell needs an object, while say doesn't.
That's a big one. And how about the difference between listen and hear? People say, I hear music every day when they mean I listen to music every day. Hear is passive, you don't control it, while listen is active.
Yes. And speaking of verbs, many learners struggle with irregular past tense forms. I often hear, yesterday, I go to the shop instead of yesterday. I went to the shop.
Oh, and pronunciation mistakes. Words like live and leave are confusing for learners. Live is short, like I live in London, while leave is longer, like I leave my house at 8 a.m.
Another common mistake is adding ed to irregular verbs that don't need it. Like, people say, I bought a new phone, instead of I bought a new phone.
Right, and let's not forget false friends, words that look similar in 2 languages, but have different meanings. For example, in Spanish, actual means current. So learners say, this is an actual problem when they mean this is a current problem.
That's a great point. And how about sentence structure? Many learners translate directly from their native language. So they say things like, "It's raining today," instead of "It is raining today."
Yes, another big mistake is with question forms. I often hear, where you are from, but the correct way is, where are you from?
And learners sometimes forget to use auxiliary verbs. Instead of "she like coffee," it should be "she likes coffee." Or for questions, "Does she like coffee?"
Oh, and one more double negatives. People say, I don't know nothing. But in English, two negatives make a positive. So the correct way is I don't know anything.
That's a classic one. There are so many little details in English that can be tricky. But once you're aware of them, it becomes much easier to avoid these mistakes.
Absolutely. Learning a language is all about practice, and every mistake is just another step towards fluency.
Exactly. And speaking of small but tricky mistakes, another one is using so and very incorrectly. Many learners say, "I am so tired," which is fine. But if they want to add more, they say, "I am so tired today," which sounds unnatural. Instead, they should say, "I am very tired today," so is usually followed by a result, like, "I am so tired that I fell asleep immediately."
That's a good one. And let's talk about prepositions because they confuse so many learners. For example, people often say, I'm good in English, but the correct way is I'm good at English.
Right. Another preposition mistake is with interested. Many learners say, "I am interested for learning English," but it should be, "I am interested in learning English."
Yes, and married with is another common one. Many people say, she's married with John, but the correct way is she is married to John.
That's a really common mistake. And speaking of confusing words, fun and funny are often mixed up. People say, "The party was so funny," but funny means something that makes you laugh. If they mean they enjoyed it, they should say, "The party was so fun."
Yes, that reminds me of bored versus boring. People say, I am boring when they mean I am bored. Boring describes something that makes you feel bored. If you say, I am boring, it means you are not interesting.
That's an important difference. And how about lose and loose? They look similar, but they have completely different meanings. Lose means you no longer have something, like "I lose my keys," while loose means not tight, like "My shoes are loose."
Yes, and another small but important one is job versus work. People say, I have a lot of works to do, but work is uncountable, so the correct way is I have a lot of work to do.
That's a great example. Oh, and let's not forget about plural forms. Many learners say, "She has many children's," "She has two furnitures," but children is already plural, and furniture is uncountable. So the correct way is, "She has many children," and "She has two pieces of furniture."
Yes, and another one people say, I need some advices. But like we said earlier, advice is uncountable, so it should be I need some advice.
Exactly. Another mistake I hear a lot is, "I look forward to see you," instead of "I look forward to seeing you." After "look forward to," we always use the ing form.
That's an important one. And since we're talking about verb forms, another common mistake is I'm thinking to go to the beach instead of I'm thinking of going to the beach.
Yes, and learners also struggle with used to. They say, "I used to go to school when I was a child," which is correct, but then they say, "I am used to study every day," which is incorrect. It should be, "I am used to studying every day."
That's true. And one last thing, modal verbs like must and have to confuse learners. People say, I must to go now, but must doesn't need to. The correct way is I must go now.
So many small details, but they all make a difference in sounding natural in English.
Exactly. And another mistake I hear often is with make and do. Many learners say, I need to do a decision, but it should be I need to make a decision. We use make for creating or choosing something and do for actions or tasks, like do homework or do the dishes.
Yes, and speaking of that, do and does can also be tricky. Some learners say, "She do her work well," instead of "She does her work well."
Oh, and how about the confusion between say and tell? People often say, he told that he was tired, but it should be he said that he was tired or he told me that he was tired. Say doesn't take an object directly, but tell does.
That's a great one.
Another common mistake is using much with countable nouns.
Learners say, I have much friends, but friends is countable. So they should say, I have many friends. Much is for uncountable things like much water or much sugar.
And let's not forget about since and for. People say, I've lived here since 5 years, but since is for a specific point in time. Like since 2018, if we talk about duration, we use for, so the correct sentence is I've lived here for 5 years.
That's an important one.
Oh, and what about hope and wish?
Learners often say, I wish I will see you soon, but we use hope for future events. So it should be, I hope I will see you soon. Wish is used for unreal situations, like, I wish I could fly.
Yes, and lend versus borrow is another confusing pair. Many learners say, can you borrow me some money? But the correct way is can you lend me some money? Borrow means to take something, and lend means to give something temporarily.
Oh, and let's not forget force friends words that sound similar in different languages but have different meanings.
For example, in some languages, actual means current. So learners say, the actual situation is difficult, when they mean the current situation is difficult.
Yes, and sometimes learners mix up library and bookstore. They say, I bought this book at the library, but a library is a place where you borrow books, and a bookstore is where you buy them.
That's a classic mistake.
And another one is with time expressions.
Many learners say, last night I have watched a movie. But if you use a past time reference like last night, you should use past simple. Last night I watched a movie.
Exactly, and speaking of past tenses, people often confuse been and gone. They say, he has gone to Paris when they mean he has been to Paris. Gone means he is still there. But been means he went there and came back.
Yes.
And one last common mistake using to instead of very. Learners say, the food is too good. That too means more than necessary and often has a negative meaning, like the coffee is too hot to drink. If you just want to say something is great, use very, like the food is very good.
That's a great one to end on. There are so many small mistakes that learners make. But once you start noticing them, it becomes easier to fix them.
Exactly. And speaking of small mistakes, prepositions can be tricky too.
I often hear learners say, I'm good in English instead of I'm good at English.
Yes, and also interested in, not interested on. Some people say, I'm interested on learning English, but it should be I'm interested in learning English.
Right. And let's not forget about look, see, and watch. Many learners say, I watched a beautiful mountain instead of I saw a beautiful mountain. Watch is for things in motion, like watch TV or watch a movie. See is more general.
Like, I see a bird. Look is used when you direct your eyes at something, like, look at that painting.
Oh, another mistake I hear is listen versus hear. People say, I hear music every day when they mean I listen to music every day. Hear is passive, you hear sounds without trying. Listen is active, you focus on what you're hearing.
That's a good one. And what about say and speak? People often say, he speaks me about his job, but it should be, he told me about his job, or he talked to me about his job. Speak is more formal, like he speaks 3 languages. And talk is for conversations, like we talked about our weekend.
Yes, and phrasal verbs can be confusing too. Learners sometimes say, turn on the candle instead of light the candle. Turn on is for electrical things like turn on the TV.
Good one.
And articles. And there are another problem. I hear, I bought apples, instead of, I bought an apple, or I bought some apples, and sometimes learners forget that when it's needed. Like, the sun is bright instead of sun is bright.
Definitely, and plural mistakes to like she have to dog instead of she has to dogs. Many learners forget the S at the end of plural words.
And let's not forget who and whom. Though whom is less common in spoken English, it's still used in formal writing. Many people say, who did you give the book to? Instead of, whom did you give the book to?
That's a tricky one. And another mistake is confusing less and fewer. People say, there are less people in the room, but people is countable, so it should be fewer people. Less is for uncountable things, like less water or less time.
Yes. And what about bring versus take? Many learners say, I will bring my laptop to the office, when they should say, I will take my laptop to the office. Bring is when something is coming towards you, and take is when something is going away from you.
Oh, and fun versus funny. People say, the party was so funny, but they mean the party was so fun. Funny means something that makes you laugh, while fun means enjoyable.
Yes, and big versus large can be confusing too.
Many learners say, I have a large problem, but big is better for abstract things. So it's, I have a big problem. Large is more for physical size, like a large house.
There are so many common mistakes, but the good news is, once you become aware of them, it's easier to fix them.
Absolutely. And speaking of tricky word choices, let's talk about job versus work. Many learners say, I have a lot of works to do. But work is uncountable, so it should be, I have a lot of work to do. However, job is countable, so you can say,
I have 2 jobs.
Good point. Another one is hope versus wish. People say, I wish I can speak English fluently, but it should be I hope I can speak English fluently. Hope is for possible things, while wish is for things that are unlikely or impossible, like I wish I were taller.
yes. And let's not forget, everyday versus everyday. Everyday is an adjective. So you say, this is my everyday routine. But when you mean each day, you write it as 2 words. I practice English every day.
That's such a common mistake, and pronunciation is another challenge. Many learners pronounce Island as Island because of the spelling, but the S is silent, so it's just Island.
Oh yes, and Wednesday too.
People often pronounce every letter, but it's actually Wednesday. Another tricky one is comfortable. Many learners say comfortably, but native speakers usually say comfortably.
Good examples, and connected speech can make English sound even more confusing. For example, native speakers don't say, what do you want? Clearly, they say, what do you want? Or instead of I don't know, they say, I dunno.
Yes, and contractions like gonna, wanna, and gotta can be confusing too. Learners sometimes think gonna is a real word, but it's just a casual way of saying going to.
That's why listening practice is so important. Sometimes English doesn't sound like how it looks in writing.
Exactly.
And one last mistake, double negatives.
Some learners say, I don't know nothing, but in English, 2 negatives make a positive, so it should be I don't know anything.
Right, English can be full of tricky rules, but the more you practice, the more natural it becomes.
Exactly. And speaking of tricky rules, let's talk about prepositions. Many learners say, I'm married with Sarah, but in English we say, I'm married to Sarah. Another one is interested. You don't say, I'm interested for learning English, but I'm interested in learning English.
Oh, prepositions are tricky. Another one is listen and hear. People say, I listen music, but it should be, I listen to music. The word listen always needs 2, but with hear, you don't need it. You just say, I hear music.
Great example.
Another common mistake is using the wrong verb form after modals.
Many learners say, I must to study, but after a modal verb like must, can, or should, we use the base verb. So it should be, I must study.
And let's not forget false friends. Some words look similar in different languages, but have completely different meanings in English. For example, actually doesn't mean currently, it means in fact. So if you say, I'm actually studying, it sounds like you're correcting someone's misunderstanding.
That's true. And one of my favorites, embarrassed, doesn't mean pregnant in English, but in some languages, it does.
Imagine the confusion when someone says, I'm so embarrassed, but means something completely different.
Language can be funny like that, but the most important thing is to keep practicing. Making mistakes is part of learning, and the more you use English, the more natural it becomes.
Absolutely. So if you've made any of these mistakes, don't worry, just keep going, keep learning, and you'll improve every day.
Thanks for listening. We hope this episode helped you avoid some common mistakes. See you next time.
Bye for now.
Keep practicing.
Bye.